Great pleasure to introduce our main speaker tonight, Dr. Alan Dieterich-Ward. I've had the great pleasure of working with Alan for two decades or so, even though we're both only 30. Yes, exactly. And he's an accomplished historian. He's a professor of history at Shippensburg University. He's a director of graduate studies out there. He's written a book previous to the one he's going to talk about tonight called Beyond Rust, Metropolitan Pittsburgh and the Fate of Industrial America, which actually won the Arline Custer Memorial Award for the best book in Mid-Atlantic history. His most recent book is Cradle of Conservation, An Environmental History of Pennsylvania. It is a quick read, incredibly informative, and I think you're very much going to enjoy his talk. So please give a warm West Virginia welcome to Dr. Alan Dieterich-Ward.
It's absolutely wonderful to be back in the Mountain State. I was actually born in West Virginia, about as far away from here as you can be and still be in West Virginia, Ohio Valley Medical Center, which closed in Wheeling. As I like to say, I grew up in Southern Ohio. The biggest city near me was Wheeling, West Virginia. And let me tell you, friends, when the biggest city near you is Wheeling, West Virginia, you are from the boondocks, right? So I'm really, really excited to be here tonight. This is actually my first time at the National Conservation Training Center. I have heard for years the myth, the tales of the El Dorado that is Club Fed, and I am pleased to say that all of the stories are true. This place is magnificent. I've made my way to everything I needed to be at, but I think I've taken the absolute longest path to get anywhere on the complex here as I could and still make it. So I was happy. I'm really happy to be here. Martha talked with you a little bit about the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project. That is an organization that was really started about 20 years ago now, or close to it. And it was formed when a group of state agency officials who had worked under Maurice Goddard. Goddard really inspired enormous loyalty in his people. He was responsible in many ways for the professionalization of the Bureau of the Department of Forests. He served under 4 or 5 governors, and this group of kind of some retired or close to retired officials really wanted to make sure that the legacy of the environmental revolution was not forgotten. And that Conservation Heritage Project that kind of began with wanting to kind of celebrate and commemorate Goddard is now really, I think, in its 3rd iteration. My book is the transition from kind of the 2nd iteration of the Conservation Heritage Project. You saw the film, which was kind of a core of that 2nd generation, that really looked to expand awareness and the documentation of that conservation era and environmental era, and kind of bring it into the public discussion at a time, particularly as the film noted, when the Marcellus shale boom was really just beginning in Pennsylvania, as models for the ways in which our predecessors in Pennsylvania understood and acknowledged the impact the economy was having on the environment, and came together across the political aisle, urban, suburban, rural, to develop solutions and answers to that those industrial problems. We're really in the 3rd phase, beginning the 3rd phase of the Conservation Heritage Project right now, and we're still really thinking carefully about what that means. The environmental justice movement, I think, has been has challenged us once again, just as the environmental movement challenged the conservation movement, to think carefully about the ways in which the environment can't be separated from broader social issues. And the kind of the 3rd phase, the Conservation Heritage Project, I think, is really looking to engage with that set of complicated, sort of very thorny issues, issues in which sometimes the heroes of the story become the villains of other stories, right? Maurice Goddard's actually a good example of that. I'll give a couple of ways in the talk how that happens. In talking with Mark and others, my sense is that Pennsylvania, our Conservation Heritage Project in Pennsylvania, may provide inspiration for folks thinking about the ways in which conservation and environmental history in other states is remembered, is told, and potentially maybe used as a catalyst for better public policy in those states. And if that's something that's getting you thinking, right, or something that you are intrigued by, boy, get in touch with us. Again, we're still an evolving organization. We're in the midst, again, of sort of reforming and reorienting ourselves in this kind of third phase. And I think we'd really love to have conversations with folks from other states and other areas who may be interested in doing similar kinds of things, in their neck of the woods, in their part of the country. So those are things that we can talk about during the conversation section after the talk. Watching that film, Mark and I talked for a minute after it. I haven't seen it in a while, there's so many really cool portions of it. I sort of feel like my talk is going to be a letdown after the slickly produced, wonderfully narrated video. So, and of course, there may be some folks who weren't here for the movie. So I want to make sure I'm connecting with everyone while also trying not to bore you. I am many things, and there are many things that you can criticize me for, but generally being boring is not one of them. So I will. I'll try to keep things lively, even as we go on. So you saw this picture. This is kind of one of the most well-known, if not cliched, pictures in Pennsylvania conservation history. This is Joseph Rothrock, Dr. Rothrock, MD, botanist from Westchester, Pennsylvania, botanist at the University of Pennsylvania. His dog, I keep remembering and then forgetting, and then remembering and forgetting his dog's name again. So we'll say his name's Skipper. It's not, but he does have a name, and I do know it. I keep forgetting it. This is a picture actually taken at one of the, I'm sure, thousands of similarly named outcroppings, Pulpit Rock, but it's right along what's now the Appalachian Trail in Franklin County, just up 81 from here. If any of you are ever up in Caledonia State Park, right on 30 near Chambersburg, you can actually hike right back to Pulpit Rock. The Department of Conservation and Natural Resources is actually in the middle right now of a somewhat controversial transformation of the Caledonia Golf Course into a conservation and natural resources education center. So Pulpit Rock will kind of once again be available and open and there for the public to view. So Pennsylvania. When I started kind of thinking conceptually about writing an environmental history of Pennsylvania, that's obviously tricky, right? Watersheds, flyways, natural features don't respect state boundaries, right? And trying to kind of tell a unified story of a state as diverse as Pennsylvania is difficult. It's especially difficult when you also want to talk about not just trees, but also urban environment. You want to talk about the entire, X 100-year history of Pennsylvania, and you want to do it in 45,000 words. So I wanted to think carefully about why to tell a story about Pennsylvania, and both why Pennsylvania matters and how we might set it up in contrast or comparison, particularly, I think, to New York State, which is kind of the state that shares its history, I think, the most closely. Tocqueville really referred to Pennsylvania as kind of the epitome of America, right? To understand America was to understand Pennsylvania. I did my best to tell a comprehensive story of the state as a whole, while also acknowledging that there are certain parts of the state that really you have to talk about a lot. You have to talk about Philadelphia. You have to talk about Pittsburgh. You have to talk about the great timber regions of the north of Pennsylvania. When we're thinking about the ways in which Pennsylvania matters as a cradle of conservation, I think the film really touched on a lot of those. At its core, Pennsylvania matters, I think, because of its industrialization itself, right? And because of the fact that you have these very kind of remote, natural resource-oriented areas that are also in a state with cities that have a lot of political power, right? So much like New York State, you have an empire that's built upon natural resource extraction that sort of manifests in the rise of these really important cities. Some differences, I think, with New York State that are going to come into real importance over the course of Pennsylvania's history, and that we can see today. I think there are two of them. One of them is entirely environmental in nature. The break in the Appalachian Mountains where the Mohawk River flows that allows for the Erie Canal to connect New York City to the west, that kind of creates New York City as the paramount city of the Americas. Philadelphia Philadelphia is eclipsed by New York City for that reason, and that really is kind of this natural phenomenon. The other is our fossil fuels, right? New York State does have some limited coal, a little bit of oil and natural gas, but far dwarfed by Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania, much like West Virginia and Western Maryland, have enormous reserves of coal, of oil, of natural gas. And if you put those two things together, and this is, I think, kind of important from just an academic standpoint, if you put those two things together, that number one, Philadelphia never becomes the kind of paramount city that New York City does, that can kind of control the rest of the state, and two, that you have places of power because of literal power, because of natural resources, kind of scattered throughout Pennsylvania. You have a Pennsylvania today that, while it shares many of the histories of New York State, if you look at the environmental politics of New York State today versus that of Pennsylvania, they're quite different, and it's really kind of for those two reasons. So I will leave off the academic stuff by and large from here on out, but I wanted to give you a sense of the ways in which and the reasons by which I kind of am framing the story of Pennsylvania as a cradle of conservation. Okay, anyway, so here is my one slide with words on it. I promise. This is literally the only slide I have with words. And the reason why I want to start with this is because this is a real framing element for the book. It's a framing element for my conceptualization of Pennsylvania. It relates to what I just said at the beginning of this talk about the need to understand environmental history and social history as being one and the same. And that's this notion of working landscapes. When we think about the origins, when we think about the origins of conservation, right, we think about the ways in which the production, the use of the natural world for production, right? Conservation is really based upon the notion that we're talking about landscapes that are not pristine, right? Landscapes that are human worked, right? That are human built, that are human designed, right? That human social structures are embedded in the world itself. And if we kind of start from that premise, right, that the environmental history of Pennsylvania is a history of working landscapes, of landscapes that are about physical work, but that are also about mental work, right? These landscapes serve to create identities, right? They serve a storytelling function, right? When we say things like the coal fields, of the anthracite region, or we say things like the northern woods of Pennsylvania, or we say things like the Susquehanna River, we feel, right? We identify, we understand. These landscapes do emotional and ultimately political work, right, in shaping public policy, right, shaping the ways that public policy can emerge. And so if we kind of build from that structure that we're talking about a lived, an experienced, a worked landscape, not something that is far away, not something that is untouched, but something that is intrinsic to our identities, intrinsic to what we are and what we do every day, that's our starting point, really, for thinking about Pennsylvania. Okay? Okay. So anyway, let's see. We start out this story, I think, with Native peoples, obviously, right? And we're going to start the story on Dock Creek in what's going to become Philadelphia. Yeah? Mark, we did a little podcast earlier, and Mark asked me about Ben Franklin. Yeah? The story of Ben Franklin is the story, I think, of conservation, right? Of an early understanding that the environment that Europeans encountered very quickly became something, could potentially very quickly become something that was toxic. If you don't know this about Ben Franklin, he was a printer in Philadelphia, and he lived his shop, and he lived right along Dock Creek, which was kind of one of the earliest places where William Penn and his people sort of established what would become Pennsylvania. Dock Creek became filthy very, very quickly. By the time Benjamin Franklin was in his middle years, Dock Creek had become so filthy with the effluence of tanneries, of stockyards, of reduction plants, that it was undrinkable, unlivable. He and his neighbors, I think in one of the first examples of NIMBYism, he and his neighbors attempted to get these tanneries shut down. They were unsuccessful. But in the last codicil to his will, shortly before he died, Ben Franklin set aside a portion of his estate to fund efforts for clean drinking water in Philadelphia. These efforts eventually, a few decades later, would become the first public, in a major city, the first public waterworks in Pennsylvania, in the United States, emerged here in Philadelphia, right? And so early on, this story of using the landscape, of extracting value and resources, but of also understanding that that had its consequences, and that there needed to be public policy interventions in remediating those consequences, emerged very quickly in Pennsylvania and in the story of Franklin himself. Okay, so if we're thinking through the working landscapes of Pennsylvania, these landscapes obviously were agricultural. Much of these landscapes were agricultural. If any of you have had a chance, Sally McMurray, who's a faculty member at Penn State, has this amazing book on farming and agriculture in Pennsylvania. If you read this book and you drive down the road and see kind of the bank barns that you oftentimes see, you'll never look at them the same again. Like you can see kind of in the modifications of these bank barns, the ways in which Pennsylvanians and others went from kind of sustenance farming through industrialized farming, right, through commodity agriculture, through truck farming. You can see the entire evolution of the ways in which these landscapes evolved in kind of the physical characteristics of those buildings. I think similarly, and this is something that I think is really cool. Where did my button go? That's what happens when you have two clickers that look the same. There we go. Okay. Similarly, if we're thinking about the working landscapes of Pennsylvania, we saw kind of the working urban landscape, the working agricultural landscape. Of course, early on, the manufacturing landscape in Pennsylvania and more broadly, ironworks. These were not urban phenomena, right? These were small town. These were rural phenomena. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the development of the charcoal furnace industry is the ways in which you can begin to see an understanding of the need for sustainability in forestry actually emerging out of the charcoal industry. There's been some recent scholarship on the ways in which charcoal plantations, as opposed to the clear-cutting timber that we're going to see later on in the 19th century, the ways in which the forestry of charcoal, of the use of wood for charcoal, actually establishes a framework for sustainable forestry later on in the 19th century. What's really cool, if you haven't even been to Cornwall Furnace in Pennsylvania, still there. It's amazing. It actually began in the 1600s and only stopped production after Hurricane Agnes in the 1970s. It's absolutely amazing. If you get a chance there, you can literally see those working landscapes of Pennsylvania's past kind of still there in their physical existence. The main revolution of the 19th century that is changing the scale and the scope of Pennsylvania's working landscapes is the evolution of transportation technology, right? I mentioned earlier on here the Erie Canal, which kind of brings New York City, allows New York City to fully surpass Philadelphia as the crown city of the colonies. Philadelphians, from the very beginning knew that they needed to find a better way to be able to access the interior of the state. Pennsylvania is is interesting if we're looking at it from a transportation perspective. The biggest watershed in Pennsylvania, of course, the Susquehanna, does not flow to Philadelphia. It flows to Baltimore, and this creates a real problem for the state as a whole, particularly for Philadelphia businessmen, and especially after their dominance on the east is overshadowed by New York City. They kind of hurriedly pushed through a measure in the state legislature to try to build a canal across the state of Pennsylvania. It doesn't work very well. It's really it's a lame canal. I mean, there's no way around it. And ultimately, they can't even build a canal the whole way across. They end up having to do these incline planes over top of the ridge of the Alleghenies. It's outdated and useless almost as soon as it comes into fruition. However, the failure of the canals in Pennsylvania spurs innovation in the railroad industry, right? Pennsylvania becomes the king of the railroad industry. The Pennsylvania Railroad, by the late 19th century, has a budget that's second only to the United States government. It becomes this real innovator in corporate power in the United States of America, precisely because canals don't work. Right, and so what we see then is this transportation revolution, as the film talked about, that spurs a revolution in industrialization. Andrew Carnegie, who we associate with the steel industry, really got his, really learned his lessons of trains loaded heavy and run fast. As he made his way up the ranks of the Pennsylvania Railroad before and then during the Civil War. That relationship between steel, coal, and rail really drives the Pennsylvania economy and, of course, drives the exploitation of natural resources really from the 1830s through the 1930s. I mean, that kind of dynamic of that need, that demand for natural resources to fuel steel, coal, and rail industries. One of the things I kind of talk about in the book, just as an interesting note, we often talk about coal as kind of superseding wood as a resource, but the reality is that the more coal, the more industrialization that you have, the more you need wood resources to support that industrialization, whether that is for railroad ties, right? Whether that is for beams to hold up the roof in the coal mines, or if that, as ultimately becomes the case, that is for lumber to build homes on the treeless Great Plains by the 1870s and 1880s, where a lot of Pennsylvania's northern woods kind of get shipped out to build homes as the United States expands. Another, I think, really interesting side note, if we're thinking about Pennsylvania's working landscapes, are the use of horses, right? So we oftentimes, again, think that the rise of the railroad sort of overcame the need for horses. But if you actually look at the historical records, the more you had railroads, the more you actually needed horses in a different way for transportation. Right? And so if you look at the greatest density, for example, of urban horses in Pennsylvania, you're going to actually see them in the early 19th century as horses are used to move things from place to place. As the volume of shipping increases, so too do you need horses for short haul transportation. That too then has a feedback effect on the agricultural working landscapes, right? As you have the ability to transport goods over longer and longer distances, as you have more and more people shifting from agriculture, from farming, to working in mills or working in urban centers, right? The more and more intense agriculture that you need to have. And of course, the intensity of that agriculture comes with industrialization, right? I mean, these are really becoming factories in the fields, right? This is the rise of tractors, right? The rise of John Deere and International Harvester. And so more and more and more, right, the natural resources of the state, the density, the intensity of extraction of natural resources, as we have industrialization happen in the state, so too does this intensity of resource extraction, right? Until we get to a point, kind of talked about in the film, by which the industrial harvesting, the application of industrial technologies to, particularly in this case, to timber harvesting, results in not an unsustainable sort of one-time harvest that creates enormous wealth over a very, very short period of time. And this is the dynamic. This is the dynamic, right? This extraction, this industrial extraction, 1880s, 1890s, that threatens the ability of Pennsylvanians, of wealthy Pennsylvanians, to look to the future and see a continuation of their ability to maintain wealth and to grow their wealth. This is what sets people like Teddy Roosevelt on the national stage to be afraid of the ability for America to continue its dominance. This is what sets the stage for men like Gifford Pinchot, as the film talked about, to begin looking to how do we go about not just applying utilitarian principles that create wealth today, but that can create it over the long term, right? And I think that's kind of my next really important point here. When we look at the origins of forestry in Pennsylvania, it is an urban phenomena, right? Forestry does not emerge. Scientific forestry, the forest movement, and ultimately the conservation movement does not emerge out in rural areas, right? It emerges in the heart of Philadelphia, and in New York City's case, in the heart of New York City. And that's not an accident, right? These are the places where wealth has been accumulated, right? It is not necessary, on a day-to-day basis to be working the land. Folks like Pinchot, right, are kind of one step removed from that and very desirous of looking to how do we make sure that this ability to continue wealth, to accumulate wealth continues. Pinchot, as much as he is associated with Pennsylvania, is really a creature of New York City, right? His mother was the daughter of one of the wealthiest real estate men in New York City. He, like many other wealthy Pennsylvanians, Philadelphians, New York Cities, vacationed in the Adirondacks, were affected by European notions of conservation. And when we look to Pennsylvania, where the forestry movement really emerges as a popular movement, right? As a popular movement, it emerges out of some of the most wealthy and well-connected Pennsylvanians there are. We look to Joseph Rothrock. The film really underscored Joseph Rothrock, who lectured on conservation at the University of Pennsylvania, right? But it was two women, Maria Cox and Mary Lundy. Maria Cox was married to one of the wealthiest coal mining families in the world, in Pennsylvania. And Mary Lundy was married to an Episcopalian minister, an abolitionist, who really had an epiphany, like Pinchot, in the Adirondacks, and saw nature as a cathedral, that preservationist kind of John Muir strain of the conservation movement. These two women were moved by a Rothrock lecture, called a meeting in their home of other well-to-do women, and that is ultimately what launched the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, which really grew to become a political powerhouse in establishing conservation in Pennsylvania, right? So there's this really cool kind of story, and I'll come back to it again, of the ways in which urbanites, the urban environment, provide, and women particularly, provide the political power to be able to get the conservation movement up and running in Pennsylvania, and then that becomes a model more broadly. As I told Mark, getting me to talk's not the problem, it's getting me to shut up, right? So I'll keep things moving. The films highlighted, don't you hate that one? You're thinking. Myra Lloyd Dock, excuse me. The films highlighted Myra Lloyd Dock, absolutely fascinating character. My former colleague, Susan Rimby, wrote a biography of Dock. If you are interested in the way in which women affected the conservation movement and affected urban revitalization, you will not find a better person than Myra Lloyd Dock. She's amazing. And I highlight this picture. This is a picture of the Pennsylvania Forestry Commission and the first group of graduates from that Pennsylvania Forest Academy that you saw in the film. At the very beginnings of forestry in the nation and in Pennsylvania, there are women there, right? There have to be, right? Women are the foot soldiers of the conservation movement, and they are the leaders in many ways of the conservation movement, much like they are of the broader progressive movement. Myra Lloyd Dock, who you can see here, is the first woman to ever serve on a forestry commission in the world, and she is the first woman to hold any political office at the state level in Pennsylvania of any kind, right? And she is here at the heart, at the beginning, much like Maria Cox and Mary Lundy in launching what becomes the conservation movement. Now, what's really important, I think, about Myra Lloyd Dock, and the film mentioned this, we don't want to and we can't separate the desire to clean up the forests and the desire to clean up urban spaces, right? So Myra Lloyd Dock is really known as the founder of the Harrisburg City Beautiful movement. As the film noted, her activities in urban beautification and her activities in rural forestry and conservation go hand in hand, right? These are kind of part and parcel of the same movement. There are consequences to these two movements, of course, right? There are social consequences to these two movements. Myra Lloyd Dock is at the heart of both of them. You can see in the back here, the film also mentioned Ralph Brock. Just as women are at the heart of the forestry movement and the heart of the conservation movement, so are people of color. When we think of the environmental movement and the conservation movement as being about making working landscapes livable, right? Those working landscapes affect urban dwellers as much as they do rural dwellers. And so if we look at it from this perspective, all of the movements for civil rights for people of color and poor people in the cities are part of this larger movement for conserving working landscapes. Ralph Brock's story is a really important one. The film talked about it a bit. Brock was a protege of Joseph Rothrock from Westchester as well. He is in this first class of foresters, the first trained African-American forester in the world. He was part of this original class, really recognized for and understood to be absolutely astounding as a nurseryman. Even before he graduated from Mont Alto Forestry School, he was placed in charge of the seedling nursery, Pennsylvania's first seedling nursery, and he went on to take charge of it. Now, if we are thinking about the environmental movement and conservation movements as connected to the broader social issues of the day, Ralph Brock's story is also a telling one in that regard, right? He is the first, but the challenges that he faces also underscore the broader social issues of the day. It becomes clear very early on that the color of Ralph Brock's skin is more important than his skills for many of the people that he works with. He's ultimately kind of hounded out of his position at Mont Alto by other students. and goes and works in the private sector to raise, to support his family in Cleveland. He ends up actually in New York City. It's a fascinating story. He ends up in New York City, comes to the attention of John D. Rockefeller as Rockefeller is building Rockefeller Center and Radio City Music Hall in New York City, and becomes the landscaper for Rockefeller Center under John D. Rockefeller, and then ultimately retires as he retires and becomes the nurseryman for the Paul Dunbar apartment complex in New York City, one of the first publicly supported public housing units for people of color in the United States. So we see in Ralph Brock sort of this connection between rural spaces and urban spaces of these working landscapes. So it really fantastic story. Here he is with this first class of foresters from Mont Alto. Okay, so as the film talked about, the broader sets of issues of social history in Pennsylvania carry on through the development of greater public policy attention to these working landscapes. The film talked a bit about the ways in which Gifford Pinchot, kind of having lost in his bid to become a state senator ultimately, and he had ambitions to be president, his type of progressivism became increasingly unpopular in the conservative Republican Party of the 1920s. By the early 1930s, Pinchot's views of government, the need for government intervention in a modest way in improving people's lives, actually puts him more in the line with the emerging New Deal Democratic coalition. He becomes friends with Franklin Roosevelt, who was governor of New York State at the time. And his actions within Pennsylvania, as the film noted, really set the stage for the development of the Civilian Conservation Corps on a national level. So if we're looking at the ways in which public policies in Pennsylvania manifest themselves and then grow to that public level, we can see that again here emerging in the 1930s. Okay? All right. Now, one of the most interesting transitions, or one of the most interesting things that I like to think about and talk about, are the ways in which the broader social context of the 20th century really shapes responses to environmental degradation. We saw the conservation movement really emerging out of a producer ethic of ensuring that natural resource production could be sustainable over the long term, right? That kind of that ethos. As we move along into the 20th century, as more and more people move away from working lives that depend directly on natural resource extraction, we see an environmental movement that begins to emerge concerned with other types of issues, right? If we think of the agricultural or the industrial working landscapes as forming the context of the conservation movement, in many ways it is landscapes like this of Levittown, right? And of the consequences of a view of the bucolic suburbs that will allow for kind of the access to urban amenities along with a clean, healthy environment for children, right? That kind of Edenic ideal of the suburbs. Of course, when you arrive and very quickly your sewer system, your septic tank backs up because it was improperly installed, and you have, a waste in your backyard, and you have phosphorus detergent, creating suds in your drinking water, and that field that your kids were going to be able to play in gets plowed over for the next suburban housing tract. This creates a new impulse toward environmentalism that's going to emerge as the environmental movement by the time we get to the 1960s and early 1970s. But just like the ways in which broader social issues affected the ability to access and engage with these healthy environments in that earlier stage, we can't turn away from the fact that racial, class, gender privileges, right, shape the experiences of those environments through the middle part of the 20th century as well, right? And so that's, I think, something that we have to really keep our mind on, that as much as we valorize and we frame the environmental movement of this as this heroic story, it is also bound by a particular social lens of those who are able to, a social perspective of those who are activists for it, right? Okay. All right, like Carson, right? And so, Rachel Carson speaks to this moment, right, where on the one hand, Americans are sort of promised, better living through chemistry, right? But on the other hand, are beginning to see that there are consequences for that, for that lifestyle. Carson brings those ideas to attention in a way that is going to manifest in a whole host of different ways, right? Some of which I think are very positive, some of which we can talk about over the long term have negative consequences. But in Pennsylvania, you see two strands really coming together to form what Franklin Curry called that environmental revolution that he talked about a little bit earlier, right? So on the one hand, we see the Rachel Carson strand, of what's going to emerge as environmentalism. On the other hand, we see the continued development through the conservation movement of the conservation of landscapes, particularly state parks. The film talked about Maurice Goddard as the father of Pennsylvania state parks. He really kind of comes out of this. Conservationist mindset, but is also focused on providing amenities for Pennsylvanians over the long term, right? And so his mantra of creating a state park within 25 miles of every Pennsylvanian, I think really speaks to this moment in which automobile use and recreation and families really come to define what it means to be living that good life. We put those two strands together and we have I'll come to this in a second. And we have what's going to be this environmental revolution in Pennsylvania, in which Pennsylvania really is at the forefront of creating this new environmental regulatory state. But, as we think about the ways in which social issues, again, affect the experience of the environment, Goddard is in many ways a hero, right? He's a hero of the conservation stories we tell. But there are always losers, right? And if one example that we have of this, I think, is the Kinzua Dam. Has anyone ever heard of the Kinzua Dam? Yeah. So the Kinzua Dam was a flood control dam. Goddard really supported it. It was part of that broader story that you saw from the film of Pittsburgh really cleaning up. One of the ways that you had to clean up Pittsburgh is make sure that the downtown doesn't flood, every spring. The Kinzua Dam was built and becomes a state park on the Allegheny River north of Pittsburgh. But it's also built on a tract of land that had been given by treaty, one of the very first treaties after the American Revolution, by George Washington to corn planter, to a native Seneca. Basically the only Native American reservation that existed in Pennsylvania. It was flooded in order to make way for the Kinzua Dam, right? And so if we're thinking about the ways in which our conservation heroes are also sort of shaped by the particular social perspective, the social lens with which we view them, Goddard becomes a cautionary tale in that regard. Later on, he's actually going to be eventually is going to his kind of greatest failure has anyone been to the Delaware Gap National Recreation Area? Anybody been there? That was supposed to be an enormous dam. That whole area was supposed to be flooded. It was going to be called the Tox Island Dam. It was part of a huge water resource management dam project that Goddard really championed throughout his life. It didn't happen, right? It didn't happen, but this really was kind of seen by Goddard as a failure, and Goddard really alienated a lot of people because of his push for this dam, right? So there are these battles that are taking place. Okay. So Pennsylvania. So between 1968 and 1972, Pennsylvania passes this enormous package of environmental legislation, right? I'm not going to go over it too much because you saw it from the film. But you have this moment, and I think that this is really, really important to think about. You have this moment in Pennsylvania where for a brief moment, as Pete Duncan said, you have this alignment of interests of urban Pennsylvanians, of suburban Pennsylvanians, and of rural Pennsylvanians around the need to clean up particularly industrial pollution, right? By the time we get to the middle part of the 70s, this also gets turned toward looking at a national level and in the state level as well, to looking at water quality for septic, for municipal waste and septic waste. But this whole package of bills that are passed in Pennsylvania, really creating this environmental regulatory state, and it comes along with this constitutional amendment that establishes a right to the benefits of a clean environment. Some of the coolest things I think are part of this are the ways in which this amendment links natural resource conservation and cultural resource conservation. Note the aesthetic values and the historic values of the environment. So we have this kind of comprehensive vision of the ways in which the working landscapes of Pennsylvania must be conserved for future generations, and the state becomes a trustee of that. Now, I should note, and I'm gonna come back to this in a few minutes, this environmental amendment is pretty much a dead letter from, it is entirely toothless for the 30 years after it is passed. It's kind of seen as noble words, but time and time again, the state Commonwealth Court and the state Supreme Court kind of refuse to really use it to overturn legislation or to empower environmentalism, right? Put a pin in that, because that's going to eventually change, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, so what happens? What happens? Well, from this kind of high point of the environmental regulatory state, of creating this kind of package that really over time shifts the entire way in which individuals interact with the world around them. The state becomes an intermediary between private property and the natural world, right? In ways that are profound, yeah? So what happens? Well, one thing that happens is 3 Mile Island. And with 3 Mile Island, some of the undercurrents of questioning science and government, right, to be effective trustees of public health are undermined, right? And this is one of those areas where I think that there are this, Rachel Carson's legacy can be a cautionary one, right? It empowers people to question science, right? But at times, it also, again, with 3 Mile Island, it comes to undermine public trust in the ability of officials to effectively maintain and administer public health regulations and environmental regulations. So that's one piece. The other piece is the environment cleans up dramatically, right? Over the course of 20 years after 1970, we see absolutely enormous gains in water quality, in air quality, in the reintroduction of species that that had been all but extinct, right? So the pressure to clean up the natural world eases from where it had been in 1970, right? And finally, deindustrialization, right? The premise of the environmental movement was that there was a balance that could be had in which the natural world could be protected, but the economy could also flourish, right? And that had really been the underlying principle of the conservation movement, right? And it had been the underlying principle of the environmental movement emerging as it did at a time of absolute unprecedented prosperity across the board in the United States of America. With deindustrialization, and particularly in an industrial state like Pennsylvania, right? You see an anti-environmental backlash that pins deindustrialization on environmentalism, right? And we're going to see kind of from this moment the ways in which the political polarization and the association of Democrats with environmentalists and Republicans with industrialists sort of emerging out of this moment of deindustrialization, right? This is that from that moment of relative sort of bipartisan support for environmental policy, deindustrialization sort of points the finger at environmentalism in ways that I think have profound ramifications that continue through with us to today, right? So what happens in Pennsylvania then in the 1980s with deindustrialization? Well, we see alternate movements for improving working landscapes that emerge out of this kind of conservative backlash. Other types of initiatives do end up working, even as we see an ebb in the push for stronger kind of traditional environmental laws. For example, as the film noted, by the early 1990s, Pennsylvania becomes a leader in brownfield remediation. How do you go about taking these abandoned, polluted working landscapes and remediating them, right? Bringing them back into a place where they can be adaptively reused for a contemporary good, right? We also see things like the farmland preservation movement, right? Where voluntarist, cooperativist, right? Community-oriented, the state providing funds that are kind of used for local initiatives, that really emerges strongly. Pennsylvania really becomes a leader in that kind of understated, I think, environmentalism. But again, one that is well suited to understanding that these are working landscapes, right? The Rails to Trails movement, another real example of brownfield remediation, right? You're out on a beautiful rail trail, you're having a great time. These are brownfields, right? I mean, like these are partially remediated, polluted landscapes, right? Pennsylvania becomes a leader in encouraging the adaptive reuse of those types of working landscapes for new productive uses. By this time, Pennsylvania has also become a leader in the reintroduction of native species, right? Mark was pointing out to me earlier in the day, one of your two, I think, bald eagle nests that you can see from the site here. I was impressed, but I have a bald eagle nest right down the road from me at my farm in southern Pennsylvania. So I was not as amazed as I might be otherwise, right? These things become sort of part of our worlds in a way that they simply weren't before. I have a little game cam on my farm at the base of South Mountain. I see foxes. I see mink. The fact that we have this successful reintroduction, successful reproduction of natural species that we didn't have before becomes this success story of Pennsylvania. Energy. Pennsylvania as an energy leader. We've gone through a number of different phases, and I've talked about a few of these. Timber, coal, oil and gas, as the film talked about. We have the development of wind energy in Pennsylvania. It looks like in the early 20th century that Pennsylvania is really going to lean into this transition to a post-carbon economy. That doesn't happen, right? And instead, of course, with the use of hydraulic fracturing, Pennsylvania has now become one of the great world leaders in natural gas extraction and production. For me, I think then to kind of get us back to that where I started this story, if we are thinking about the ways in which Pennsylvania is a cradle of conservation, it remains to be seen how Pennsylvania is going to deal with this latest, with this latest twist in its working landscapes. As I mentioned early on, the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project really emerged kind of out of this question of how do we use the past, the mistakes and the successes of the past in order to create new public policies going forward for us. And I think it really comes out of this moment where everyone's mind was on natural gas, right? And what will that look like? The most recent presidential election, I think, really underscored that we don't have a clear sense as a nation, as a state, as a region, on what all of this means for the future of the environmental movement, really the future of ourselves as a people. Pennsylvania is a good laboratory for sorting out those issues, right? Unlike, again, someplace like New York State, where downstream interests, New York State has natural gas, right? As does Maryland, yeah? But the coalition, the political power in those states are really downstream urban folks, right? Who are not set to benefit from the economic development of those that natural gas production directly. And so you have a ban on fracking. Pennsylvania is much more evenly balanced politically, and so it really becomes this place where I think these issues that are really national and global issues are going to play out in the coming years. I think it'll be really interesting. As a human being, I'm mortified. As a historian, I'm really interested, right? Because this is a story that I think has great potential for helping us to understand what's going to go on more broadly. Mark asked me a little earlier, sort of, kind of, what do I take from this? What do I look to for the future? And one of the things that I think about a lot is what's the next paradigm? What's the next face of remediating and creating working landscapes that future generations will live in. We've had the paradigm of conservationism. We've had the paradigm of environmentalism. My sense is that we're just beginning a paradigm of what we're calling environmental justice, right? And for me, environmental justice is a question, not so much a statement. Like, what does environmental justice mean, right? What does it mean to balance the benefits of natural resource extraction from the costs of natural resource extraction? Who are the winners and who are the losers in that equation, right? And the winners and losers of environment, there were winners and losers of the conservation movement, there were winners and losers of the environmental movement. To my mind, this big question of what does justice look like, what does environmental justice look like, justice for whom, right, and for how long, to my mind are the great questions that come out of thinking about Pennsylvania's status as the cradle of conservation, right, but also as the cradle of these energy movements, particularly and most recently the fracking movement. So I think that gives us a place to start with questions. Thanks.
Well, welcome to the Future of Conservation podcast. My name is Mark Madison. I'm the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And we have a very distinguished guest with us today. Dr. Alan Dieterich-Ward is with us. He is a professor of history at Shippensburg University, and he's come out here to tell us a little about his brand new book, Cradle of Conservation, An Environmental History of Pennsylvania. We're so glad to have you here, Alan. Thank you.
Mark, it is absolutely my pleasure.
So the first obvious question, since I'm a national historian, is why is Pennsylvania so important?
Well, Pennsylvania really is the cradle of conservation. In addition, of course, to being the birthplace of Gifford Pinchot, yes. Quite literally. Many of the practices and policies that became so significant on the national level really either originated in Pennsylvania or came out of this kind of mid-Atlantic framework that really demanded a response to industrialization, to urbanization, that resulted in the key conservation movement, the environmental movement, the environmental justice movement. You really can't divorce the geographic context, the economic context, really the social context of Pennsylvania from what became those broader social and political movements.
Yeah, it really comes out how many national figures we're familiar with, and some I'd never heard of before, in spite of being in the field for 30 years, came out here. I would love to hear how Ben Franklin is an early conservationist. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, so Ben Franklin was, a man of many talents and,
yes.
and many, many interests. But early on, he came out of this kind of context of Philadelphia that was one of the leading philosophical and scientific hubs of the entire Atlantic world, right? And so we often think of him as, as Ben Franklin the politician, Ben Franklin the businessman, Ben Franklin the inventor, but he was also most definitely Ben Franklin the environmentalist. And I had mentioned that all of these movements really come out of this context of Pennsylvania industrialization and urbanization. It really, in many ways, Franklin is coming exactly out of that. The earliest sort of settlement in Philadelphia was at Dock Creek, and Franklin ended up living right along Dock Creek. Dock Creek, by the time Franklin was in his middle years, had become filthy. The tanneries were there, right? The reduction plants were there. It had become disgusting. And so in the last, so early on, he launched a movement with his neighbors to unsuccessfully attempt to ban these noxious industries from his community. I guess Ben Franklin the NIMBY might be a good appellation. So that didn't work. But in the last codicil to his will before he died, he actually added a provision providing for a portion of his estate to go to fund the development of a public drinking water system in Philadelphia that later on served as the foundation for America's first, kind of major cities public water system.
That's a fascinating addition. It's not in the Apple TV streaming show about Ben Franklin, unfortunately. But
It's maybe not quite as sexy as some of the other aspects of Benjamin Franklin's life, but of course he was a man of his time. There's no doubt about it. But his kind of early understanding that without good, clean drinking water, and by extension other natural resources, a community simply could not function, could not be sustainable over the long term. He recognized that, and then provided some of his private fortune to fund it.
You mentioned Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot helps popularize the new word conservation, really the father of the American conservation movement. What role does Pennsylvania have in shaping his conservation outlook?
Well, Pinchot is an interesting figure, right? Yeah. Because so much, particularly of his early professional career, he is an ambitious man, right?
He is.
There's no doubt about it. And a man who kind of believes in his vision of the way forestry should work. And much of his young life, Pinchot spent in New York City, right? So his family, a couple of generations after leaving France, made their fortune in Pennsylvania, but then ended up moving, and he really becomes this kind of New York City guy. And in many ways, I think, before I answer your question directly, Pinchot really underscores the back and forth movement of ideas within the Mid-Atlantic, particularly between New York City and Philadelphia, among the elites of those communities. As these New York City elites are really thinking about protecting the New York City drinking water, protecting the long-term sustainability of the Erie Canal, in this kind of discussion that's eventually going to become the Adirondack Preserve, the Catskill Preserve, Pinchot had some of his formative experiences in the Adirondacks. Char Miller does a great job of kind of talking about Pinchot's childhood excursions into the Adirondacks. Other key figures, lesser known but equally important key figures from Pennsylvania, also spent time in the Adirondacks and sort of were in that same social milieu. Pinchot's real story is he and his family really, like many other of these mid-Atlantic families, gained their wealth off of natural resource extraction, timber, coal. And so he becomes one of these, early advocates of, we've made our wealth. We're concerned that the practices that are happening now to make that wealth are not going to be repeatable, are not going to be able to last over the long term. And they're very concerned about kind of the patterns of that they had seen in Europe happening in America as well. And so, Pinchot's view that becomes conservation really comes out of his understanding of those extractive industries in Pennsylvania and New York. So even though he kind of leaves Pennsylvania
Right.
and is kind of known with the U.S. Forest Service in kind of preserving, well, in conserving, definitely not preserving,
Conserving, yeah.
conserving Western lands. Later on in his career, when he shall we say, departs on less than ideal terms from the federal government.
Right.
He comes back to Pennsylvania,
Yep.
serves a term as governor, and then kind of launches an unsuccessful bid for Senate. Is considered a presidential candidate, but that wing of the Republican Party kind of has fallen out of favor. And then in the Depression, when his ideas about conservation, kind of the Rooseveltian state,
Right.
look more like Democrats by that time than Republicans, he's actually elected for a second non-consecutive term as Pennsylvania governor. And in terms of his impact directly on Pennsylvania, that's really when Pinchot is so important. He launches a progenitor to the Civilian Conservation Corps that
was fascinating
that
part of
his
the book.
friend Franklin Roosevelt, the second of the Roosevelts, right, is going to then sort of transform into the federal level. He also launches kind of a predecessor to broader public works projects, what becomes the Work Projects Administration. And then finally, and we were just talking about this a little while ago, he actually sees a need for additional state intervention in road building and kind of statitizes all of these little back roads in order to keep the farmers out of the mud. And that then, I think, becomes an underpinning for later notions of roads as being sort of really important public projects, culminating after Pinchot's out of office in the development of the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
So Pinchot,
And I could go on and
I
on
know,
about
yeah,
Pinchot,
well,
but we're going to stop it right
well,
there.
he's America's most famous forester.
Indeed.
Creates the Forest Service, but there's another forester in there, Ralph Brock,
Uh-huh, yeah.
who deserves to be better known. Tell us a
Most
little about
definitely.
Mr. Brock.
Well, and that is one of the, one of the goals of Cradle of Conservation of the book is to, I had a couple of goals. One of them is to break down this distinction between rural environments and urban environments. After all, just because you build a building doesn't mean the environment goes away,
Right.
And so we have to be careful that we don't sort of exclude people from the story of conservation,
Yes.
the story of environmental history, by saying, well, some environments are natural environments and some are not, therefore the stories over here don't matter. If we take that broader view and think more carefully about conservation history not just being about trees, though they are very important, but also thinking about the ways in which conservation is part of these broader social and cultural movements,
Right.
looking at people like Ralph Brock, who was a protege of the father of Pennsylvania forestry, the
Yep.
father of Pennsylvania forestry, Joseph Rothrock. Ralph Brock was an African-American, grew up in Westchester, came to the attention of Joseph Rothrock, who really was the Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania, if you will. And he was part of the very first forestry class at the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy, Mont Alto. The very first trained African-American forester in the world, and was part of the very first forestry class. I mean, this isn't something that comes along later. People of color are central to the story of conservation in Pennsylvania. And Ralph Brock's story has kind of been resuscitated and he is celebrated. But Ralph Brock is also a cautionary tale. Ralph Brock, despite he, even as a student, his skills as a nurseryman were very well established. He was the supervisor as a student, and then as a professional forester, the very first state nursery, right? He was the director of that. But within 5, 6, 7 years, it became clear that his color was more important to many people than his skills, and he is essentially kind of pushed out. He goes and works in Cleveland. He's got to make a living for his family. He goes and works in Ohio for a while, and actually he comes to the attention of John D. Rockefeller, of all people, right? And he becomes the landscape nurseryman for Rockefeller Center, for Radio City in New York. And then eventually becomes the nurseryman and the landscaper for the Paul Dunbar Apartments, which are really, really important, kind of very early public housing in the United States in New York City. So his is both a celebratory tale, but also a cautionary tale, because there aren't a lot of African American foresters after Ralph Brock. And so this notion that certain people are welcome within conservation and certain people are not, Ralph Brock is part of that story as well.
And you're absolutely right. You unearth a lot of stories that we don't know as well. But I'm
Yeah.
going to go back to one more famous
Sure,
one because
please.
I have to.
Uh-huh.
Our most famous employee
course.
and one of the most famous environmentalists to come out of Pennsylvania is Rachel Carson.
Sure is. And talk about someone who is both celebrated and a cautionary tale, right?
Yes.
I mean, we, in all of the celebration that we have of Rachel Carson, we forget sometimes the vilification that she faced. As soon as she went from, and I tell my students, Rachel Carson, I think in many ways would prefer you didn't start with Silent Spring, that you'd start, her power came from her ability to wed the humanities, right, with the scientific expertise. Under a Sea Wind, there is a reason why she is up for the National Book Award, why she's a Newbery Medalist. She is amazing. But hers is a cautionary tale too, because as much as we celebrate her, her work is still controversial. In some circles, it's absolutely still controversial. There's no doubt about it. I think in broader terms, we can also place Rachel Carson in this trajectory of questioning science, right? In both productive and unproductive ways, I think. And so, much like Pinchot's early on, Carson becomes one of the founders of this movement, but she does so on this kind of national stage. That said, much like with Pinchot, if you have to read Silent Spring with an eye toward knowing Rachel Carson's childhood, right? The opening vignette, right, of this beautiful community along the river in which the birds are no longer singing. That is pretty darn close, to Rachel Carson's childhood story. And so,
Grown up outside of Pittsburgh.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
Springdale,
Yes. And so, from my sense, thinking about the ways in which many, Zanisser, Carson, Pinchot, the environment, the social, the cultural, and the natural environment of Pennsylvania that shape all of the worldview of those folks, you can't understand the conservation movement more broadly without understanding its origins here in the Cradle.
It's a great book. Covers Pennsylvania environmental history comprehensively and concisely, something historians are not known for. Now I'm going to end with a totally unfair and cruel question to ask a historian.
Cut.
But we do call the podcast The Future of Conservation. And I think history informs our
indeed.
future decisions. Having looked at the history of environmental conservation, preservation in Pennsylvania, what do you see for the future there?
Well, this book runs pretty close up to the present.
It does. It does. Yes, it does. And I've been thinking through this a lot lately. So I'll say two things about that. Right?
Great.
One is, and this is the way I end the book, the disruptions of COVID, I think, we're still living with the negative ramifications, of course, of COVID. But one of the positive ramifications of that period is that it came just at a moment when there were some questions, I think, about the ways in which nonprofit management of trails, of the ability to fully fund our state parks and public spaces, there were questions, I think, about how this new digital world and everyone on their phone was going to affect local community spaces, right? The working landscapes that we all live in every single day. I know from my local rail trail that the usage of that rail trail skyrocketed during the COVID pandemic. All of a sudden, this this kind of linear park was the community space where people could feel safe to be able to interact. And those numbers have not gone down. And I think that they have helped to underscore sort of a looking back toward the physical, local, natural community in a way that, that I think will continue to have positive ramifications. I mean, we could all do with a little bit of looking to our friends and neighbors locally, rather than getting caught up in the latest sort of social media snafu. The other thing that I would say in thinking about the future of conservation, I think environmental policy and environmental worldview more broadly sort of go through paradigms, right? And those paradigms ebb and flow based upon broader social issues, and of course, obviously, also on broader environmental, natural, what's going on in the world. We've lived through the conservation paradigm. We've lived through the environmentalist paradigm. My sense is that we're now at the emergence of an environmental justice paradigm. And just like the environmentalist movement questioned some of the underlying assumptions of the use of land in the conservation movement, so too do I think the environmental justice is questioning some of those same assumptions, not just, of course, of the environmentalist movement, but also of the anti-environmentalist movement that emerged kind of at the same time. For me, and I'm a historian, so I don't, I don't have to come up with the solutions. That's just my job to ask the questions. Right. My sense is that using the environmental justice as a start for questions, rather than a notion that, well, this is just a given. This is what environmental justice means. This is what it doesn't mean. And using that as a framework for making sure that we do not divorce the natural world from the human world. That we're always thinking, like the conservationists did in many ways, of the ways in which nature over the long term and humans interact with one another, not divorcing physical, culture from nature. To me, that, kind of that as an opening for questioning some of the assumptions of the environmentalist paradigm about what is good, what is bad, who are the heroes, who are the villains even, I think could do us all some good. To my mind, the polarization in our politics at the moment is rooted, forgive the pun, at least to some extent, in a producer's worldview and a consumer's worldview. And the reality is that we have to find mechanisms by which we can do right by the world from both of those perspectives, sort of if we're going to be able to have good public policy going forward.
It's an eloquent coda to a brief podcast. We've been talking with Dr. Alan Dieterich-Ward about his new book, Cradle of Conservation, An Environmental History of Pennsylvania, where he looks to the past and to the future. Thank you, Alan, for your time, and thank everybody who gave us the precious resource of their time.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.